They said I was the luckiest woman alive, marrying one of the richest men in America. Cameras flashed, champagne poured. But what happened in front of 300 guests that night left everyone frozen. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. It was a perfect evening in late September. Amara Cole stood beneath a chandelier of gold light, her white dress glimmering as she smiled for the cameras. Across the room, her new husband, Ethan Cole, the tech magnate everyone admired, raised his glass, charming and confident. They were America's dream couple. Beauty, power, and love, wrapped into one picture-perfect moment. But during their first dance, everything changed. The music faded mid-song as Ethan's expression hardened. He pulled his hand away, whispered something sharp under his breath, and stepped back. The crowd went silent. Amara froze, her heart pounding as Ethan walked off the dance floor, leaving whispers floating through the air. Guests exchanged nervous glances. Cameras stopped flashing. No one knew what to do. That night, behind the mansion's closed doors, Amara found Ethan pacing in his office, phone in hand. "It's done," he muttered, not noticing she was standing there. When he turned, his face was pale, distant, not the man she'd just vowed forever to. "What's done?" she asked quietly. He didn't answer. Weeks later, the truth began to surface. Ethan's empire was collapsing. Millions missing, investors furious, headlines erupting. The company he'd built was under investigation for fraud. Every luxury in their home, the cars, the vacations, even her wedding ring, had been paid for with borrowed lies. Amara's fairy tale had been built on sand. One morning she found a letter tucked inside a drawer. Ethan had written it before their wedding day. "If anything happens, know that I did it to protect you." That was the moment her anger gave way to heartbreak. She realized he hadn't just betrayed her. He'd destroyed himself trying to keep up the illusion of success. Ethan was arrested months later. Amara never saw him again. She moved to a quiet town, took a simple job, and stopped explaining her story to anyone who asked. But one evening, watching the sun set from her porch, she whispered to herself, "Maybe losing everything was how I finally found peace." So let me ask you, if you discovered the person you loved most had built your entire life on lies, would you stay and forgive them, or walk away to start over? How would you handle it if you were in Amara's shoes? Because sometimes, the most painful endings are really just the beginnings of who we're meant to be. Amara was 29 years old, bright, talented, and proud of the life she'd built on her own. She ran a successful interior design firm in Atlanta, known for her eye for detail and her ability to turn the simplest spaces into something people never wanted to leave. Friends described her as grounded, the kind of woman who never let success get to her head. She often repeated her grandmother's favorite words, "Never let money make you forget your worth." That quote hung in her office, framed above her desk, as a quiet reminder of the woman she wanted to be. Then came Ethan Cole, 41 years old, a billionaire tech investor, a man the media adored. His face graced magazine covers beside headlines like "The Genius Who Built an Empire Before 40." He was a philanthropist, a speaker, a visionary. To the world, he seemed unstoppable. To Amara, he seemed kind. The way he listened, the way he made her laugh during their first dinner at that small restaurant in Buckhead, where he insisted they split dessert because he wasn't good at goodbyes. Their connection felt effortless, almost cinematic, the kind of love story that makes people believe in fate. Within months, their romance became a public spectacle. Luxury photo shoots, charity galas, glossy magazine spreads, Atlanta's golden couple. People whispered about their chemistry, the way they looked at each other like the rest of the world didn't exist. Every social post painted a picture of perfection. Private jets, ocean sunsets, smiling faces. But as Amara later admitted, perfection can be its own disguise. Ethan had a way of making everyone around him feel small, not with words, but with presence. He carried a calm authority that demanded attention, and when he looked at you, you felt as if he already knew what you were going to say. It was intoxicating and quietly unsettling. There was one thing, however, Ethan was always careful to hide. He never talked about his past, about the years before his success. Whenever Amara asked, he'd smile and say, "Some stories don't need to be retold." At first she thought it was humility, but later she would realize it was something else, something much heavier. The first time Amara saw the darkness in his eyes was the night before the wedding. It was late. Everyone else had gone to bed. She had stepped out onto the balcony of the lake house they'd rented for the ceremony, looking out at the still water reflecting the moonlight. Ethan stood there already, a drink in his hand, staring into the dark. His face was distant, unreadable. She placed a hand on his arm and asked, "Are you okay?" He didn't answer right away. He just exhaled, long and slow, and said quietly, "You ever think about what happens when people finally see who we really are?" Amara smiled, trying to lighten the mood. "I already see who you are," she said. He looked at her then, and for a split second she saw something flicker in his eyes. Guilt? Fear? She couldn't tell, but it was the kind of look that stays with you even when you try to forget it. The next morning he was back to his charming, confident self. No trace of the man she'd seen on that balcony. And when she walked down the aisle hours later, surrounded by flowers and music, she told herself it had just been pre-wedding nerves. But deep down, a small voice whispered, "What if that wasn't nerves at all?" And as you'll soon see, that moment, that single uneasy glance under the moonlight, would become the beginning of everything that followed. It was the night before the wedding. The lake house was quiet, lit only by the soft hum of candles and the faint glow from the hallway sconces. Guests had gone to their rooms, laughter fading into silence. Amara couldn't sleep. Her heart raced with a mixture of nerves and excitement, that feeling every bride knows the night before forever begins. She wanted to do something thoughtful, something simple. Ethan had always talked about how much he admired people who noticed the small things. So she decided to leave him a handwritten note, something he could read before walking down the aisle. She slipped quietly into his study, barefoot, her robe brushing against the wooden floor. The room smelled faintly of whiskey and cedar, Ethan's signature scent. His desk was perfectly organized, like everything else in his life. Amara smiled to herself as she picked up a pen and paper, but when she opened a drawer to find an envelope, something caught her eye. A thin folder tucked beneath a stack of documents. Its label was plain, private. She hesitated. For a moment she thought about leaving it untouched, but curiosity has a way of whispering louder than reason. She slid the folder out, her hands trembling slightly. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, women she didn't recognize. Some looked like professional headshots, others were candid, taken without the subjects knowing. Beneath the photos were signed papers, non-disclosure agreements. The names blurred in her vision, her pulse quickening. Her breath hitched when she saw another file, thicker than the rest, labeled with her name, Amara Bennett Cole, background report. She opened it, and her world tilted. Inside were photos of her family's home in Atlanta, her mother's workplace, her sister's college schedule, notes about her grandmother's health records. He had her entire life mapped out, like she was a business acquisition. She couldn't breathe. The silence of the house pressed against her ears as she flipped through page after page. There were summaries of her career, mentions of past clients, even projections of her company's financial growth. It wasn't love written in those files. It was calculation, precision, control. Her hands began to shake. The paper rustled, and the faint sound of her own heartbeat filled her head. She felt the weight of every word she had ever said to him, every secret she had shared. He had known it all before she ever told him. For a moment, Amara thought about waking him, confronting him, demanding to know why. but the thought of shattering everything they had built, or thought they'd built, stopped her. She could hear her grandmother's voice echoing in her mind, "Never let money make you forget your worth." And for the first time she wondered if she already had. So she placed everything back exactly as she found it, closed the drawer, and whispered to herself, "Tomorrow's a new beginning." She turned off the light, walked back to her room, and stared out the window until dawn. The lake was still, calm, almost too calm, as if it knew something she didn't. And when the first rays of sunlight broke through the mist, Amara took a deep breath and told herself everything would be fine. She believed it because she needed to, but as she would soon learn, tomorrow never came the way she imagined. The morning of the wedding arrived wrapped in sunlight and money. The estate looked like something from a magazine cover. White roses lined the pathway, crystal chandeliers hung from silk-draped ceilings, and a quartet of violinists played soft melodies that floated over the manicured gardens. 300 guests arrived in designer suits and glittering gowns, their conversations blending into the rhythm of champagne glasses and distant laughter. On the surface, it was flawless, every detail perfect, every smile rehearsed. But inside, Amara's chest was tight. As she stood before the mirror, the weight of her gown felt heavier than she imagined. Everyone saw perfection, she would later recall, but no one saw fear. Each time she caught her reflection, she tried to convince herself she was happy. She was marrying one of the most admired men in the country. Yet her hands trembled when she adjusted her veil, remembering the folder she'd found the night before. She tried to bury the thought, telling herself it was nerves, not a warning. When she walked down the aisle, Ethan smiled the way only he could, calm, confident, in control. Cameras flashed, guests sighed. He reached for her hand and whispered just loud enough for her to hear, "Keep your chin up. Don't ruin the photos." His tone wasn't cruel, but it was sharp, commanding, practiced. During their vows, she caught him glancing toward the cameras more than toward her. She realized then, this wasn't just a wedding, it was a performance. During the photo sessions, Ethan leaned close, his voice low and precise. "Smile wider," he murmured. "You're stiff. Loosen up. Remember, this will be on the cover." To everyone else, it looked like a loving whisper, but Amara could feel the subtle shift, the control beneath the charm. He directed her every movement like a producer crafting the perfect scene. Ethan's family hovered nearby, polished and polite, but their eyes told a different story. His mother smiled tightly, offering compliments that felt like stings wrapped in sugar. "She's beautiful," she said to a friend, pausing just long enough before finishing, "for where she's from." A cousin nodded in agreement, adding, "She's done well for herself. You can tell she's trying." Every word was coded in elegance, but Amara felt the divide, the quiet reminder that she didn't come from their world of old money and private schools. The reception glowed with luxury. Waiters carried champagne on silver trays. Violinists played beneath a canopy of roses, and drones filmed every angle of the celebration. From the outside, it looked like joy, but Amara's smile felt rehearsed, her laughter hollow. Every time Ethan touched her arm, she felt herself shrink just a little bit more. The control wasn't loud. It was quiet, invisible, the kind that looked like care but felt like power. Then came the vows, the moment that would change everything. As she stood across from him, hands trembling, she looked into his eyes and decided to speak from the heart. She said softly, "I don't need your name or your fortune to feel whole. You've given me love, but I've always had purpose." The words slipped out before she could stop them. A few guests smiled, thinking it was romantic. But Ethan's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing for just a moment. Quick enough for her to see, subtle enough that no one else noticed. That was when she realized it. Something in him shifted. A small crack in the perfect mask. The applause came, the music swelled, and they kissed for the cameras. But behind that perfect image was a growing silence, the kind that hinted at something much deeper. And as the night unfolded, Amara couldn't shake the feeling that what pushed Ethan over the edge was something she said during those vows. The ballroom shimmered beneath chandeliers, each crystal reflecting the glow of 300 expectant faces. The air was thick with perfume and anticipation. The violinists played softly as Amara stepped forward to deliver her vows. Her voice trembled at first, but then steadied with conviction. She wasn't reading from the paper Ethan's publicist had suggested. She spoke from the heart. "Love isn't ownership," she said softly, her eyes meeting his. "It's choosing someone freely every day, not because you have to, but because you want to." A murmur ran through the crowd, admiration, curiosity, pride. But Ethan's expression didn't move. His smile, so perfectly trained for cameras, began to fade. The faint muscle in his jaw tightened. For a moment she thought he was just emotional, overwhelmed by the moment. But then his eyes hardened, cold and unrecognizable. She finished her vows with a small, hopeful smile. The room erupted in polite applause, but Ethan didn't join them. He stepped closer, so close she could see the tension in his face, the fury burning behind restraint. And then, in one sharp, stunning motion, he raised his hand and struck her across the face. The sound echoed through the hall like a gunshot. Gasps, screams. The violinists froze mid-note, bows hovering in the air. A champagne flute shattered against the floor. For a split second, no one moved, not even Amara. Her head turned slightly from the force, a red mark blooming against her cheek. Camera flashes continued instinctively, as though the photographers couldn't comprehend what they'd just witnessed. Guests looked around in disbelief. Some whispered her name, others looked toward security, but no one stepped forward. It was as if the world itself had stopped spinning. Ethan stood there, breathing heavily, his face pale, his chest rising and falling. He didn't speak. He didn't apologize. He just stared at her. That same controlling calm now replaced by a quiet, furious panic. And then came the silence. It stretched so long it felt unbearable. Amara could hear her heartbeat in her ears, fast and heavy. She looked around. Faces she'd known for years now avoided her gaze. A friend mouthed her name, frozen in place. Her father rose halfway from his chair, then sat back down, stunned. In that moment something shifted inside her. The shame, the fear, the disbelief. It all turned into clarity. She felt no tears, no trembling, no urge to run. Just stillness. She looked back at Ethan, who seemed smaller now, almost fragile beneath the weight of what he'd done. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid. She was awake. The silence broke all at once. Voices rising, security stepping in, flashes still popping as guests shouted for someone to help. Ethan tried to speak, his words drowned out by the chaos around him, but Amara didn't hear any of it. She turned slowly, her veil slipping from her hair, and walked away from the altar, her footsteps echoing louder than the whispers. The image of that moment would be replayed across news stations for weeks. The perfect wedding turned nightmare. But in that instant, before the world saw it, before the headlines spun their story, Amara understood something the cameras never could. Sometimes, the moment everything breaks is the same moment you finally wake up. For a few seconds after the slap, the room was soundless, a vacuum of disbelief. Amara didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just stood there, the imprint of his hand still warm against her cheek, her eyes steady on his. All around her, chaos rippled. Gasps, whispers, a camera dropping to the floor, someone calling her name. But Amara heard none of it. Her world had narrowed to the sound of her own breathing and the pounding of her heart. Her inner voice whispered quietly, almost gently. If I moved, I'd fall apart, so I stayed still, until I knew what to do. Ethan's mother rose from her seat, eyes wide, trying to signal for someone to stop recording. The violinists lowered their instruments. Security hesitated, unsure whether to intervene or pretend nothing had happened. Every camera lens pointed toward her, hundreds of eyes waiting to see how she would react. But Amara didn't give them what they expected. She took a slow, steady breath, straightened her shoulders, and began walking toward the microphone at the center of the stage. Each step echoed through the marble floor, calm, deliberate, unbroken. The crowd parted, unsure whether to watch or look away. Ethan reached out a hand, muttering her name, but she didn't stop. Her veil trailed behind her like a ghost of the life she thought she had. When she reached the microphone, she looked out across the sea of faces, friends, colleagues, strangers, every one of them frozen in the aftermath of a moment they would never forget. Her voice was soft at first, but unwavering. "You all came here to witness love," she said, her words slicing through the silence. "And maybe that's exactly what this is teaching me. Love without respect isn't love at all." The crowd didn't move. Even the air felt heavy. Ethan stood motionless, his hand trembling slightly at his side. She took another breath. "You can build empires, you can buy headlines, you can own companies, but you cannot own a person. Not me, not anymore." No one clapped. No one spoke. It wasn't the kind of moment that called for applause. It was the kind that burned itself into memory. She turned from the microphone, lifted her head, and walked out of the ballroom, past the photographers, past the guests, past the man who once promised her forever. That night, the headlines would call it "The Wedding That Stopped America." But to Amara, it was something else entirely. It was the first time in her life she'd ever felt free, and what she said next changed her life forever. Because sometimes the moment that destroys everything you thought you wanted is the very same moment that begins the rest of your story. But what Amara did after she walked out of that room, that's what no one saw coming. Amara's hand trembled slightly as she held the microphone, but her voice came out clear, firm, sharp, alive. The kind of voice that carried truth whether people were ready for it or not. The crowd was silent, still trying to process what had just happened. Then she spoke, her words cutting through the tension like a blade through glass. "This," she said, her eyes fixed on Ethan, "is what control looks like. But this will be the last time he ever touches me." A ripple moved through the audience. Gasps, murmurs, disbelief. Some guests stood frozen in empathy, others in denial. Ethan's family looked horrified, his mother clutching her pearls, his father staring at the floor. But Amara didn't stop. She adjusted the mic and continued, her voice growing steadier with every word. "You all think you know who he is," she said, gesturing toward Ethan, "the generous philanthropist, the brilliant investor, the man who built an empire. But what none of you saw were the files, the folders, the NDAs, the private investigator who followed my family for months before we even met. He knew everything about me, my mother's job, my sister's college, even my grandmother's health records. To him, I wasn't a partner. I was a project, a name to add to his list of acquisitions." A few guests gasped audibly, others looked at each other in disbelief. Somewhere in the back, someone whispered, "She's lying," but no one moved to stop her. The atmosphere was electric, thick with shock and truth. And then came the glow, the small, subtle light of phones lifting into the air. Guests were recording. Live streams flickered online within seconds. "Smile for the cameras, right?" Amara said softly, her eyes glancing across the crowd. "You wanted a show. Well, here's the truth. You can dress up control in designer suits and luxury vows, but it's still control, and I'm done being part of the illusion." The room erupted, voices colliding, gasps, applause, shouts. Half the guests moved toward her in support. Others whispered frantically into their phones, already calling publicists. One woman started crying quietly near the front row. Ethan stood still for a moment, his face pale, eyes darting toward the phones capturing every second. Then, in a burst of anger, he slammed his champagne glass against the table and stormed out, the sound echoing through the hall. Cameras followed his exit. His PR team scrambled. The band had stopped playing entirely, and yet, amidst the chaos, Amara remained standing, the mic still in her hand, her breath calm, her expression steady. In that moment, she was no longer the bride. She was the truth everyone had been too afraid to see. Within minutes, clips of her speech spread across social media. Shaky phone videos captioned, "Bride exposes billionaire at wedding," flooded timelines. Millions of views, thousands of comments. Support poured in from strangers around the world who didn't know her, but understood the pain behind her voice. And somewhere outside, as Ethan's security rushed him into a waiting car, he finally realized what had happened. His empire wasn't built on technology, reputation, or wealth. It was built on perception, and Amara had just shattered it. Inside the ballroom, the string quartet began playing again, slow, haunting, defiant. Amara stood alone at the microphone, breathing deeply, the weight of her choice settling in. This wasn't the life she had planned, but it was the truth she had finally chosen. And as the crowd's noise faded into the background, the narrator's voice lowered to a whisper. But the real storm was still coming. Behind closed doors, billionaires play a different game. The next morning, the world woke up to headlines that spread faster than wildfire. Billionaire's wedding meltdown. The slap heard around the country. Runaway bride exposes tech titan. Every news outlet had a version of the story. Every photo captured her in that frozen second, eyes wide, cheek red, truth unspoken. And while the world dissected her face, her words, her tone, Ethan's team was already rewriting the story. Within hours, his lawyers released statements calling her emotionally unstable, dramatic, and distressed under pressure. His PR agency framed it as an unfortunate misunderstanding exaggerated by social media. They painted him as a man blindsided by love, a victim of public hysteria. The media machine worked quickly, erasing context, twisting facts, reframing a moment of violence into a rumor of chaos. Friends who had once filled her messages with congratulations went silent. Some unfollowed her, others politely texted, "Thinking of you," then disappeared. Sponsors pulled out of her upcoming projects. A major interior design firm she'd been negotiating with quietly withdrew their offer. Emails that once began with, "We'd love to collaborate," were now replaced with silence. Amara sat in her small apartment, scrolling through articles written by people who had never met her, strangers deciding who she was, what she deserved. For the first time, she felt what it truly meant to be erased not by silence, but by narrative. "The system wasn't built to protect women like me," she said in a later interview, "especially against men like him." While Ethan's empire reshaped itself, his influence lingered like smoke. Former colleagues warned her to let it go, to stop making it worse. One journalist even emailed her privately, "These men don't lose, they just rewrite history." And for a moment, she believed it. Maybe the world really didn't want the truth, just entertainment. Then came Kira, a young investigative journalist from Chicago with a reputation for exposing what powerful people buried. She reached out quietly one night with a single message, "I believe you, and I think I can prove it." Amara hesitated, afraid to trust another stranger, but Kira's voice over the phone was calm, deliberate, and unwavering. She'd been following Ethan's career for years, studying his connections, his shell companies, the NDAs that seemed to follow every woman who had once been close to him. "Do you really want to know who he is?" Kira asked. Amara hesitated, staring at the reflection of herself in the dark window, the city lights flickering outside. "I already know who he is," she said quietly. "I just don't know how many others he's hurt." Over the next few weeks, Kira began digging. Flight records, financial transactions, old court filings buried under corporate layers. Every file revealed another name, another woman silenced by contracts and money. Each detail pieced together a pattern that had existed long before Amara ever met him, And when Kira called one night, her voice shaking slightly, Amara knew what was coming before she even said it. "And what Kira found," she whispered, "made me realize I wasn't the first." Kira's investigation tore open a history Ethan Cole had spent decades hiding. She uncovered sealed NDAs buried under shell corporations, quiet settlements labeled as consulting fees, and confidential payouts masked as philanthropy. Each document carried the same signature, his, bold and practiced. The deeper they dug, the more chilling the pattern became. Dozens of women, each with eerily similar stories, each silenced by legal threats and money. None of them ever spoke again. One of Ethan's former assistants finally agreed to speak on camera. Her hands trembled as she recounted what she'd seen. "Every woman who left him," she said, voice breaking, "just disappeared from the industry, like they never existed." Her eyes darted off camera, as if afraid he might still be watching. When word of Kira's upcoming exposé reached Ethan's team, the tone shifted from arrogance to aggression. Lawyers began sending cease and desist letters daily. Anonymous numbers texted Amara late at night. "Drop the story or we'll ruin you." "You think you're brave? You're not. We know where you live." But Amara was tired of being quiet. One evening, sitting at her kitchen counter with only her phone and the weight of her own heartbeat, she pressed record. No lighting, no script, just truth. Her voice was steady, raw, unfiltered, real. "My name is Amara Cole," she began, "and this is my truth." She spoke for 11 minutes straight, recounting the night before the wedding, the folder she found, the slap, and everything that came after. She didn't cry, she didn't shout, she just told the truth, calmly, like someone who had already lost everything fear could take. Within hours, the video spread across every major platform. Millions watched, commented, argued, defended, doubted. Some called her brave, others called her a liar. Talk shows dissected her every word. Hashtags trended. Influencers weighed in. The world had an opinion about her, but few stopped to ask how it felt to finally speak after years of silence. She stared at the screen, watching her own face go viral, realizing that truth was no longer hers alone. It belonged to the crowd now. And as her story spread, so did the danger. "I thought telling the world would set me free," she whispered in her next recording. "I was wrong." The world reacted exactly as Amara feared, divided, loud, cruel. Overnight, her name became both a symbol and a target. Comment sections turned into battlefields. News anchors debated her tone, her tears, her timing. Some praised her courage, calling her a hero for speaking out. Others questioned her motives, accusing her of seeking attention, of trying to destroy a good man's life. The media didn't just tell her story, they dissected it. Every expression, every pause in her video became evidence for or against her truth. And beneath it all, the ugly undercurrent of bias ran deep. Headlines questioned her background, her upbringing, her ambition. Would this story look different, she wondered, if I looked different too? The hate didn't stop at words. Strange cars lingered outside her apartment at night. Her email filled with threats. "You'll regret this. We know where you live. He made you. You should have stayed quiet." Her phone rang constantly, unknown numbers, heavy breathing on the other end. The same media that once called her the luckiest woman alive now called her unhinged, vindictive, a cautionary tale. One night, the noise broke her. Sitting alone in the dark, phone buzzing on the table, she whispered to herself, "He took my peace." Her voice cracked, the words almost too heavy to speak. "But he won't take my voice." She closed her eyes and let the tears fall, not from weakness, but release. In the quiet that followed, she realized freedom isn't beautiful. It's costly. It's lonely. But it's real. And as she recorded one final message to her followers, her tone changed, no longer just for her, but for everyone watching in silence. "For every woman told to be quiet," she said softly, looking straight into the camera, "this is for you. For every person who stayed when they should have run, for every voice that was silenced, you are not alone. I see you. I was you." And for the first time, her words didn't echo back emptily. They landed, they resonated, because this time, the truth wasn't just hers. It belonged to everyone who'd ever been afraid to speak. Months passed, and the storm began to settle. Not because the noise stopped, but because Amara no longer lived inside it. She had learned that healing wasn't about waiting for silence. It was about creating purpose through the pain. Instead of hiding, she turned her story into a mission. With the help of Kira and a few trusted allies, Amara launched a foundation dedicated to helping women who had faced abuse within high-power relationships, the kind where money and influence often bury the truth. She named it The Worth Project, after her grandmother's words, "Never let money make you forget your worth." Slowly, the narrative shifted. Public support grew as more women came forward, not just about Ethan, but about others like him. Amara began speaking at universities, corporate events, and survivor summits. Her calm voice carried the weight of experience and the light of survival. "You don't have to be unbroken to be strong," she said in one speech that went viral. "You just have to choose yourself, again and again." Meanwhile, Ethan's empire began to crumble. The same investors who once applauded his vision quietly withdrew. The SEC opened an investigation into his financial dealings after Kira's reports revealed irregularities. His company's stock plummeted. Former partners distanced themselves, and the media that once glorified him now questioned his ethics. The man who had built his image on control was finally losing it, piece by piece. Months later, the court ruled in Amara's favor in the defamation lawsuit his lawyers had filed against her. The verdict wasn't just a legal victory, it was a symbolic one. The judge's words echoed in the courtroom. Truth is not defamation. For the first time in years, Amara walked out of a courthouse not as a victim, but as a survivor. Standing on the courthouse steps, surrounded by cameras, she didn't smile for the headlines or pose for the lenses. She just spoke softly into the microphones. "He thought he broke me," she said, her voice steady and unshaken, "but he built the woman I was meant to become." And at that moment, it wasn't about Ethan anymore. It was about every person who had ever been hurt and still found a way to rise, louder, braver, and free. As the months turned into a year, the noise faded into memory. Amara stood on a quiet hill overlooking the city, the sunset washing everything in gold. The same skyline that once felt cold and distant now shimmered with possibility. She smiled, not because life was perfect, but because she had learned how to live again. Behind her, women from her foundation laughed as they painted the walls of a new shelter, their voices filled with hope instead of fear. It wasn't the life she planned, but it was the one she built with her own hands, her own courage, her own truth. Her voice carried softly over the final moments. Sometimes strength isn't about fighting back. It's about walking away and never looking back. The screen fades to black, her words lingering like a heartbeat. Then gently, the voice returns, steady, warm, and reflective. What would you have done in her place? Do you believe justice was truly served? Tell us in the comments below. And if this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that reveal the truth behind the fairy tales.